Hello, everyone. Today we'll continue talking about Kant's conception of a good life, and in particular, his conception of servility and arrogance. So let us begin. So let's start with servility. Servility it derives from the word that is connected to servile, to means to be a servant, but it means something much more specifically. It doesn't mean helping others, being a servant to others, assisting others. That's good, right? That's benevolence, at least in general. It could be. But there's something in the vicinity of benevolence, in the vicinity of helping others, of being a servant to others, that is actually a vice, a very serious vice. And that's what Kant regards, what he calls servility. So let's look at it more carefully. For Kant, servility is essentially a failure in self-respect. And self-respect is itself a condition for respecting others. So Kant thinks that a basic condition for treating people morally, and in fact for acting freely, is to recognize people as they are, namely as moral agents capable of making decisions for themselves and being responsible for their actions. And that includes ourselves. Part of what it is to treat ourselves well is to recognize that we are moral agents. In self-respect is the recognition of our own agency and then the taking responsibility for our own actions and acting. So servility is one particular way of failing to recognize ourselves as moral agents and thereby failing in self-respect. The other is arrogance. Those are the two main ways of failing to have self-respect. But anyway, so having told you exactly what servility is, so far the only thing we know is that it's a deficiency or failure in self-respect. So the first question is, what is this self-respect that servility and also arrogance get wrong? So self-respect for Kant is understanding one's own worth, which ultimately, as we'll see shortly, is grounded in one's dignity and one's talents, hard work, dedication, excellence more generally, and furthermore, acting on the basis of it. So to respect ourselves, to be engaged in self-respect, is to recognize our own value or our own worth, and then to act on the basis of the value that we have. That's the basic idea of self-respect. Again, it presupposes dignity and then talents and excellences, and we'll talk about those later. To engage in self-respect is to understand our own dignity and our own value that is grounded in our talents and our abilities, and then to act that way, and to expect other people to act that way, or put differently, to only engage in acts with other people that themselves, those acts, respect our dignity and our talents and our own worth. So anyway, once we have a certain sense of self-respect, this grounded in dignity, now we can think of different ways of messing it up, ways of failing to respect ourselves. And here are two basic ways of failing to respect ourselves. One is to undervalue our own worth, and that is servility. That's the vice of servility, to act as though we are not as valuable as we in fact are. And then the other way of messing it up, the other way of not being self-respectful, is to overvalue our own worth. And perhaps the second deficiency, arrogance, is more common than the first one. That doesn't really matter for our purposes, as what matters is not so much how many people do one or the other. What matters is that both of these are ways of failing to respect ourselves. What is respecting ourselves? Again, is recognizing our value and our worth and then acting accordingly. So servility is to undervalue ourselves. And here's a much more careful way of articulating what servility is. To be servile is to serve the interests of others, right? That's the servility part. That is to help others, to promote the well-being of others. And notice that described that way, that's benevolence. That's great. So benevolence and servility many times look alike. They're hard to distinguish. What makes benevolence is that the agent is acting for the sake of the good of the other, but in such a way that it does not undermine their own self-respect. What makes servility is that someone is acting for the sake of the interest of someone else in a way that undermines their self-respect. So here's the way I put it in the PowerPoint. To be servile is to serve the interest of others in a way that implies that they are superior or that their happiness, goals, agency, or interest are greater than their own. So if you have a project, say painting your house this weekend, and then you have a friend, and the friend also has a project painting their house that weekend, and then the friend calls you up and says, oh, hey, I have a project and I need to paint my house. Would you mind helping me? And then you think, well, that clashes with my own project of painting my own house, but he's more valuable than me. His interests count more than my own. His happiness counts more than my own. So I should help him first and then help myself. That is a paradigmatic example of servility. If the reason why you go help your friend is because you think his happiness counts more, his goals count more, his kind of well-being counts more than yours, is to be taken more seriously than you, he's in some sense superior than you are, and that's why he takes priority. If those are your actual motivations, you are being servile. Now, you can still go and help your friend if you want, but in a way that is benevolent and not servile. That is, you can say, hey, both of our happiness counts the same. You think that way, you believe that, you understand it. But then you say, well, we cannot do both at the same time, so we must choose one or the other. Let's go with him first. That's fine. I mean, there's no big deal. Something like that, right? Something like, I want to help him out. And you can have your reasons. And that can be benevolence. What makes a servility is that the reasons that you have include your thought that the friend's well-being or happiness or goals counts more than yours. If you're thinking that way, you're acting that way, you're motivated to that way, that's what it is to be servile. And that's a serious deficiency in self-respect. You, as a matter of fact, count as much as your friend, and you should treat yourself accordingly. So this gives rise to these kinds of examples give rise of two different ways in which one can be servile, two different kinds of servility, and it's important to distinguish those. Those are significantly different. Servility one, for lack of a better word, is the not failure to understand one's own worth. Is someone who actually does not realize their happiness is just as valuable as someone else's happiness. Their goals are just as valuable as someone else's goals. They just don't realize that. And unfortunately, there are examples like that. Here in the story, in the example, in the book, used the following example. Suppose a woman is raised in a very explicitly patriarchal or sexist society, which includes thinking that males are naturally superior. Their interests should take priority over the interests of women. The fact that they're male should entitle them to positions of authority and power and wealth and decision making and things like that, and so on, right? Like that kind of society, which unfortunately is much too common in the real world. But anyway, a woman who grows up in that society and just internalizes the values that structure the society. That woman may not realize that, as a matter of fact, she is as valuable as males. Because her society, has inculcated in her, has taught her that she should think of herself as inferior. So that person lacks a particular kind of self-respect. The person fails to understand her own worth, so she's servile in the first sense of servile. Kant thinks that she's in fact mistaken. As a matter of fact, worth is grounded in dignity. Dignity is grounded in moral agency, and women can be responsible and are responsible for their actions just as much as men. They have the capacity to think, to understand right from wrong, and that is the basis of their dignity. So we both, men and female, have the same basis for our dignity. Therefore, we have the same worth. Therefore, our happiness counts the same. This society, the whole society, is mistaken. So when the woman internalizes the mistaken values of the society, she's unfortunately being servile. She fails to know her own worth, and then she acts accordingly when she lets men make decisions and so on. So that's one kind of servility. It's a different kind of servility. Let's call it servility 2. Servility 2 is when a person chooses to engage in degrading activities, knowing full well that they are degrading or undermining of her self-worth. In other words, servility 2 is not like servility 1. Servility 1, the person just does not know how much she's worth. And so in the case of servility 2, the person does know how much he or she is worth, but then decides to act and engage in activities that undermine or degrade her value. So I think one of the examples in the book was something like a person that engages in sexual activities for money, right? Someone who sells their body for money. It seems that that's a good candidate for someone who is engaged in an activity that is degrading. It doesn't have to be that, though. So someone who's treated. So one of the examples was a secretary who's used to make petty tasks around the office because she's female. Then the person, the boss, is treating the secretary as though her time is worth less than other people's time because she's female. And then the female, the secretary, can accept that, can act that way anyway, can take the job anyway, and be willing to do those menial jobs because she's female, right? She's willing to enter this arrangement, social arrangement, knowing full well that is degrading, that is making her status as an equal agent be undermined in the very social situation. Kant thinks that this decision to enter the kind of enterprise is not worth it. And crucially, that when the person chooses to engage in this kind of servility, these degrading acts, they're hurting themselves, they're harming themselves, they're wronging themselves. So even though they're choosing to enter into these kinds of arrangements, it's still wrong for them to do so. So we can wrong, just like we can wrong other people, we can wrong ourselves. When the boss treats the secretary as though her happiness counts less, her time is less valuable, and so on, the boss is certainly wronging her. That's straightforward. But Kant is also saying that the secretary herself is wronging herself when she willingly enters that kind of arrangement, that kind of degrading job or social activity more general. So if you do that, if you do servility, you're a sellout. That's the technical word that Storr uses. So a sellout is someone who's willing to trade the dignity for something else, who's willing to engage in degrading activities for the sake of getting something external to their worth. And Kant is going to think it's never worth it. It's always foolish. It's not part of the good life. Let's talk a little bit more about this. So to be a sellout is to exchange your basic principles more generally, and dignity in more particular, for other things. And the typical examples are wealth and fame, though it doesn't have to be that. It can be appreciation. It can be staying in a romantic relationship with someone. People are willing to abandon their principles or the dignity for the sake of like the approval of one particular person, a romantic partner. This applies for moral principles more generally. So if you're willing to sacrifice your principles for the sake of getting something else, you already count as a sellout. You're already doing servility to type of actions. The most significant one, though, are the principles attached to your dignity and your self-worth, entering in activities that are degrading or demeaning. That's the main kind of being a sellout. So to be a sellout is essentially a kind of self-servility. So it's a servility that is self-imposed. For it is treating your value as a mere price. It is treating yourself as a commodity, or at least your dignity as a commodity, something can be sold in exchange for money. And Kant thinks that's an essential mistake. That's using yourself in a way that is essentially contrary to the moral law. To be moral is to realize that no humans should be used, including yourself. To use a person as a mere thing and not a person, not recognize them as a person, is to misuse them, is to wrong them. And then you can do that to yourself in the case of self-servility. So it is a serious mistake not worth doing. You're sacrificing your dignity and your freedom for the sake of something else, and nothing else is worth it. So a way of kind of putting that together is to say that our true happiness, which is something like our happiness plus freedom, the kind of happiness to be attained within the bounds of freedom and morality, that's true happiness. Our true happiness requires our recognition of our own dignity, and then to act only on the basis of actions that themselves recognize our dignity, to enter social arrangements, to enter kind of romantic relationships and friendships and so on, with the condition that everyone there is recognized as equal, with equal dignity, they have the same worth, and that all of the arrangements respect those facts. That's a condition for true happiness, claims Kant. So anyway, all of this discussion has been about arrogance, and a lot of similar things can be said about arrogance. All of the discussion has been about servility, but a lot of the same observations can be made about arrogance. Servility, again, is undervaluing yourself. Arrogance is overvaluing yourself, and they're both failures in self-respect. They're both failures to recognize the kind of thing that you are. Anyway, in this context, Storr makes a distinction between two different ways of respecting someone. And so far, we've just been talking about this one, recognition respect. That's the kind of respect due to persons because of their status as moral agents, because of their dignity. So everyone's happiness counts the same from a moral perspective. Everyone's goals are equally valuable from a moral perspective. Everyone's agency and freedom is to be equally respected from a moral perspective, right? To recognize those claims is to have recognition respect towards humanity in general or towards particular individuals. That's what we've been discussing so far. But there's another kind of respect that should be noted. And this is, for lack of a better word, appraisal respect, because it's judged on a kind of appraisal or assessment of a person and a person's character. And this is the kind of honor or admiration due to someone because of their talent, their accomplishments, and their hard work. And those are different. Those are separable. Someone who's, couch potato, who doesn't really do anything with their lives, who's wasting their time, they still should be treated with respect, with recognition of respect. They're still valuable human beings, just like everyone else. However, they don't have a lot going for them in terms of appraisal respect. Someone like Martin Luther King Jr. has a lot of appraisal respect on top of a recognition respect, right? The appraisal respect is the development of his human skills, and especially for the promotion of a better society. So appraisal respect is the respect that people deserve on the basis of their talents, their accomplishments, their hard work, their excellence. But that's other than and not reducible to recognition respect. So those are importantly different. Typically, people that are arrogant, not always, but typically people that are arrogant fail to see this distinction and fail to many times recognize recognition respect at all. So many times people that are arrogant tend to treat others as though the only thing that matters in other people are their talents, their accomplishments, and their hard work, or even worse, how much money they have in their bank account and things like that, or how beautiful they are, appearances and things like that. So many times people treat others as though their value and worth is dependent on things that have no correlation whatsoever, like how much money in your bank account, or things that are correlated with appraisal respect. The Kantian main point is that recognition respect, the true worth of a person, is grounded in dignity. And then there's this other thing, which is the appraisal respect, which is grounded in things like talents and other things. To be arrogant, or at least arrogant people that overvalue their own sense, tend to ignore others, especially ignore the recognition of respect. Someone who's, say, very successful and talented might look at a couch potato and feel entitled to abuse, the couch potato person because of their lack of talents and accomplishments. Kant would say, of course, the accomplished person has more appraisal respect. That is, it deserves more admiration from the community because of their success and talents and so on. But does not entitle the person to abuse the couch potato. Couch potatoes rights are grounded in their dignity, not their success. So the couch potato deserves to be treated with decency and respect, and not to be verbally abused by someone who's more talented. The greater talent just does not entitle someone to abuse the person that does not have those talents, because the lack of abuse is grounded in the recognition respect, not the appraisal respect. In arrogant people, those that tend to verbally abuse others tend to ignore those facts. Sometimes and this is related to the previous point, the arrogant person tends to think that recognition respect depends upon appraisal respect. In other words, some people think that treating people with admiration and honor and respect depends upon, or is exclusively based on their talents or work and so on. And that's a serious mistake, because it's ignoring the most fundamental type of recognition, namely recognition respect, namely recognition respect. Thirdly, people that are arrogant tend to assign themselves a greater amount of recognition respect or appraisal respect than they are due. Sometimes people that are successful think that because they're successful, their recognition respect, that is their intrinsic worth, should be greater than others. That's a serious mistake. It's not. Sometimes one is arrogant, not because one sees one's talents and thereby deduces mistakenly that one's dignity is greater, but one, even worse, just exaggerates the level of talents that one has. So when one gives oneself a greater assessment of their talents and skills, one is being arrogant. When one thinks that one has greater dignity than others, one is being arrogant. And sometimes those come together in different ways. But anyway, let's end here. I will see you next time. Bye.